Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome as we wait for 5:30. And as we pause for the final few seconds, perhaps you can be pondering if you have a favorite Narnia book or a Narnia character that you would like to have a cup of tea with. It's 5:30 on Monday. Welcome, everybody, to our Monday session, which is when we have 7 thoughts about various characters. We've looked at G.K. Chesterton, Pontius Pilate, Corrie ten Boom, Elvis, and today it's C.S. Lewis. There is so much that could be said. I'm very conscious that there are 1 or 2 people who may be watching this who know much more about C.S. Lewis than I do, and 1 or 2 indeed who have met C.S. Lewis. So we honour you and your memories and your friendship of him. And apologies for the things I'll say which aren't quite right. And also inevitably the selection of the 7 thoughts from someone whose life and whose work was so full. Lewis was born in Ireland in 1898, died in Oxford in 1963, lived and worked in Oxford for a great deal of his life, wrote many, many books, spoke in many, many places, and is still widely read today. Narnia books, the most popular of his writings, estimated sold about 100 million copies worldwide, translated into many languages, but he wrote many, many other books as well, including academic books in his main subject, English. He's a member of the English faculty here in Oxford, and then in Cambridge towards the end of his life. And as well as those books and the Narnia books, some science fiction books and some books exploring faith and values and humanity. Still widely read, still much enjoyed. 7 quick themes, if I may. First of all, an ongoing theme for C.S. Lewis was the idea of yearning, that whenever we sense beauty and joy beyond our immediate understandings, then that says something about us and what we're reaching to. And so he said at one point, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. C.S. Lewis came back to Christian faith in his early 30s, and part of that journey was that sense of joy, of beauty, of longing for something more. And he felt that, as with all our desires, the fact that that desire is so strong within us is perhaps evidence that there is that something more that we are reaching towards. But as one writer has recently pointed out, this was part of Lewis's intellectual reach for faith, but also an emotional one as well, that he was yearning for something more. In one of his great sermons, now called The Weight of Glory, preached here in Oxford during the Second World War, he said this: when we look for the items that we think, where we think we can find this beauty and longing, he says this: the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. And that search for a country that he felt he had never yet visited spiritually and emotionally, and then that encouragement to others through his career to keep searching for that country that perhaps we feel we haven't quite visited yet. This sense of yearning, this sense of longing, this sense for joy. The second point is about communication. As I said, Lewis wrote and spoke much. He was very robust in how he felt communication should be done. This is what he said: always prefer the plain, direct word to the long, vague one. So those of us who enjoy using long, vague words, Lewis would take us to task of that. He likes plain, direct words, partly because it's easier for the listener, but also a great Lewis theme is if we cannot put it in plain, direct words ourselves, perhaps we do not quite understand it ourselves. So if ever we seek to hide behind the long, vague, esoteric words, no need to a few academics, then perhaps we're not quite capable of understanding what we're really thinking. He said at another point, always try to use the language so as to make quite clear what you mean, and make sure your sentence couldn't mean anything else. That was advice to someone who was wondering how they should be writing. Always try to use the language so as to make quite clear what you mean, and make sure your sentence couldn't mean anything else. Thirdly, a big theme in Lewis's writings was morality and the fact that we are called to behave well. Quite a lot of his thinking was informed by medieval literature and the spirituality expressed in those writings, and of course based in the scriptures, also Greek philosophy and elsewhere. He was keen that we behaved well. He said this: a man who is eating or lying with his wife or preparing to go to sleep in humility, thankfulness and temperance is by Christian standards in an infinitely higher state than one who is listening to Bach or reading Plato in a state of pride. And Lewis, very interested, as many scholars are, in the 7 deadly sins popularized in the Middle Ages. Pride is seen as the most deadly of sins. So whenever we do anything, if it's looking worthy, but if we're doing it in pride, then we are not in a state of grace. But if we are trying to do our best in obedience and humility, even if they may seem trivial things, doing the washing up, washing the car, whatever it may be, if we're doing it with humility, compassion, love, justice, then we are on the side of the angels. As a Christian, part of his view of morality is that God wishes to help us to behave better. So we have this, a slightly longer quote. Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he is doing. He is getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You know that those jobs needed doing, and so you are not surprised. But presently he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of, throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. Lewis would argue that God has high plans for us, and part of that is our behavior. But many of us came across Lewis because of his reputation as someone who would argue for the Christian faith rationally. Jesus called us to love God with our hearts and souls and our minds. And a little bit like Chesterton, as we looked at a few weeks ago, Lewis was prepared to use his mind to say that if we believe in God, we have not left our brains at home, much as others may wish to give that impression of us. So he would argue robustly, and he formed a society here, the Socratic Club, and he would write many articles and speak with many people saying it is reasonable, it is rational to believe that there is a God. It is reasonable, rational to take these arguments seriously. One of his most famous quotes came from Mere Christianity, which was the written version of some radio broadcasts during the war. And this particular quote has been looked at and critiqued many times. I say it here because it reminds us of the centrality of Jesus to Lewis's belief, and also his robust approach to debate. He loved discussing with his friends and with his intellectual adversaries. He loved that robustness. It's also, whether we agree or not, we know that we need to find an answer. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, that's Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Striking stuff, and we can imagine in the debating society people coming back at that, writing back to him. He loved discussing things with his friends. We may know he was part of a group called the Inklings, and they met twice a week when they could in Oxford and would discuss what they were thinking, what they were writing. That group including J.R.R. Tolkien, lots of stuff about the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien. But we're not going there because I promised I'd keep to 7 things. And my 5th, I think I've reached 5, actually, yes, 5th, I think, suffering and sadness. Suffering and sadness. Lewis had many big, sad moments in his life, especially as a child when his mother died and he was aged 9. That's huge, as we all know. Also, later on in life, when he found love and marriage with Joy, and then she died. And that was huge as well. During his career, there were many disappointments. He wasn't always quite as recognized as perhaps might have been expected, given his intellectual weight. So he knew what it was to be sad, to go through suffering. He wrote this. This was after his wife died. We were promised sufferings. They were part of the program. We were even told, blessed are they that mourn. And I accept it. I've got nothing that I hadn't bargained for. Of course, it is different when the thing happens to oneself, not to others, and in reality, not imagination. And then in Narnia, and this was when a boy's mother is ill, and remember that Lewis himself, his mother died when he was young. Up till then, he had been looking at the lions, that's Aslan, looking at the lion's great front feet and the huge claws on them. Now, in his despair, he looked up at its face. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life, for the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of wonders, great shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as if the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. my son, said Aslan, I know grief is great. Only you and I in this land know that yet. Let us be good to one another. And that love, that empathy, that understanding, that deep faith that Christ weeps when we weep. He knew what it was to suffer and to speak to people who were suffering. Part of that is his immense pastoral concern. He very quietly gave quite a lot of money away to people who in need. He also wrote a lot of letters. Most of his letters are in these 3 volumes behind, which, as you can see, are big. And the care and the love that he put in those letters to anyone who wrote, and he writing them alongside and with the help of his older brother, Warnie, they tried to do their best in writing letters. He cares very carefully about what he writes. And this letter, just a little example, in 1942, and we pick up the sympathy with the lady who clearly was having difficulty with temptations. We pick up the hope that Lewis wishes to bring, and we pick up his theological understanding of the God who always welcomes us home. I know all about the despair of overcoming chronic temptations. It is not serious, provided self-offended petulance, annoyance at breaking records, impatience, etc., doesn't get the upper hand. No amount of fools will really undo us if we keep on picking ourselves up each time. We shall, of course, be very muddy and tattered children by the time we reach home. But the bathrooms are all ready, the towels put out, and the clean clothes are in the airing cupboard. The only fatal thing is to lose one's temper and give it up. It is when we notice the dirt that God is most present to us. It is the very sign of his presence. There's lots of theology and lots of pastoral love in that letter. It always makes me think how much care do we put in hasty texts or hasty emails or hasty letters. Lewis wanted to do right with the people in need contacting him. And then lastly, our seventh. Lewis was one of the few writers who wrote about heaven. Now, just go back to my first point about the yearning that he felt that we all had, that there is something out there of beauty and of joy, and we yearn for it. In that same sermon, The Weight of Glory, that I quoted earlier, he wrote this: "At present we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in." And then the Narnia books end up with this: "The term is over, the holidays have begun. The dream is ended, this is the morning." Lewis often used that image because his school days had been unhappy himself for him. So that image of heaven being like the school holidays. The term is over, the holidays have begun. The dream is ended, this is the morning. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. Our 7 points. We have had here with someone who sensed a yearning for something bigger than just the physical. Here is someone who is very keen on clear communication. Here is someone who is committed to morality and trying to live lives of obedience and love. Here was someone who is prepared to argue rationally for what he believed in. Here was someone who knew what it was to be sad, who had great empathy for the suffering of others, would always take that seriously. Here was someone who was very concerned, caring for the individual, wrote letters so thoughtfully. Here was someone who was prepared to think about heaven and the joy that awaits us there. Whenever I do these little 7 thoughts of, I guess part of the hope is that maybe one or two may think I would like to know more. And huge thanks, I think, is due for all of us to those who have worked so hard over the years to ensure that Lewis's books stay published and available. And if anyone would like to go and buy some and get some or borrow some, then please do so to find out more for yourselves. And our grateful thanks to all those, as I say, who have made that possible over the years. One of them, and I hope I'm going to get this quote right, one of them is Walter Hooper. And I think that it was Walter that said about C.S. Lewis, he was the most converted man I knew. Forgive me if I've misattributed that, but Walter Hooper, we honour you for all that you've done, and also all the others in the Lewis entourage, if I can put it like that. In Westminster Abbey, there was a ceremony in 2013 when Lewis was remembered in Poets' Corner. And this was the sentence of Lewis's writings that was chosen to be there. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. He was someone who felt that if God had called him, then his whole life needed to be as fully converted as possible. And therefore, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. All the people he met, all the work that he did, all the conversations that he had. For him, this was the sunlight that lit it all up. Thank you so much for listening this evening. Hope you have a good evening.